Welcome back to She Really Gets It. I'm Stefanie Rhodes, health educator and reformed public health professional. And in this week's episode, we will be speaking with Dr. Beatriz Reyes. And we're going to be talking about reproductive justice in Indigenous communities. So who is Dr. Beatriz Reyes? Well, she's an amazing friend. She's an auntie, she's a partner, a sister, a cousin, and community member. As a Dene and Mexican queer woman, she has the honor and responsibility of being an assistant professor of instruction in global health studies. Her teaching focuses on health research, qualitative methods, community-based participatory research, and their intersection in Native American health. The views she expresses here are her own and do not reflect those of her institution. So, Beatriz, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
We're really excited to have you. And we're just going to jump right in. So, you are a professor. You're in global health studies. What does that mean?
I crush student dreams, basically. It's kind of my common joke. No, but for real, I feel like the program I'm in right now is just one of the best that I've come across, at least in my experience as a grad student and undergrad. I just felt like there wasn't enough of a critical lens, but I think in the program that I'm in, the Global Health Studies program, most of the faculty are teaching faculty. So we have a really critical lens of global health studies. So really thinking about what does it mean to engage with these concepts on a global scale when, thinking about the local and domestic issues, we're not really thriving, but we have this idea that we can judge what's happening globally. So that's what I mean by crushing student dreams. I'm you can't really judge other countries because we're kind of not the greatest or the best, period. So yeah.
I love it. So we've been friends for quite a few years and we talk all the time, but honestly, it wasn't until recently that I realized that you specialized in reproductive justice, reproductive health. Why did you decide to go in that direction? And what does reproductive justice mean as opposed to abortion rights?
No, I think this is something that's a long time coming. I'm convinced it's because I'm a former Catholic now. That's a big part of it. So I have a really critical perspective on what it means to understand the rights of a person, their access to care. Grad school had a heavy hand in that. And I think that was one of the best experiences, is really thinking about health from a human rights perspective. But I think taking it further than that is really important. So always learning is obviously really important to me, but I wouldn't say I'm a specialist. I know there's some other people who are just killing it with this issue, but I feel as an Indigenous woman in this country, I've had to learn my rights and learn why those things exist and how they come back again and they affect different people, including Indigenous women. And then currently, basically all the women in this country right now with, the decision from the Supreme Court about Roe v. Wade. So thinking about that over the years just really influenced my own learning. I didn't really learn much of this in school. It was all self-taught. So I really like your concept of reformed public health practitioner, because I feel so many of us have had that experience, right? Leaving school and teaching ourselves things that we just never learned.
Yeah, exactly. I think working in very white dominated spaces as a person of color, as Black, as an Indigenous, that's an education within itself.
Yeah, one I didn't sign up for.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do this.
So I know when I think of my concepts of reproductive health years ago, it was always around abortion, abortion, abortion. And I really didn't learn much else. I know that you talk a lot in your classes about forced sterilization and in general, just a more comprehensive concept of reproductive health, comprehensive reproductive health.
Absolutely. I guess I should, thinking about my own, pedagogy and teaching. This is definitely a trigger content warning about like some of the heavy shit we're going to talk about today, like thinking about harm against children, sexual assault. I'll try my best to use like the most sensitive language. And I say that in a way as like, I know there's words that can be really like triggering and like also get people like in a really difficult space. So I'm going to be really careful with that. But yeah, like absolutely. I learned about reproductive justice when I finished grad school, and just kind of trying to learn how to like understand this. And obviously it goes back to this concept from Loretta Ross, a Black woman who was one of the co-founders of Sister Song, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. And they have a definition that I just personally use all the time. And it's kind of thinking about more than just abortion. And it's not to say abortion is not important, but thinking about what does it mean to have the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and then the right to parent. And what are the social aspects of a person's life that allows them to realize those rights? So kind of moving further past pro-choice. I think pro-choice is a really important movement, but I think it excludes a lot of conversations and can make it seem, I don't know, in a way that's like very medical and health focused that doesn't really take into context the lived experiences of people who have children.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So when you think, just to go further with that, what isn't being discussed? Because is it, when you think about the right to raise children, I think of social workers, knocking on your door because someone thought you were speaking sternly to your child, or they made assumptions about you based on your race that you must be abusive or incapable. What is that? What do you think is missing in these conversations?
I really appreciate that you brought up social workers, because I think so much of public health takes methods and perspectives from social work and sociology in general, I think too, and that those can be really harmful in ways that, whether intentional or not, can have like dramatic effects on families and communities. So when I think about social work, for me, this is the thing. I feel like I've always understood reproductive justice. I just didn't have the framework until I came across that definition. And so when I think about the right to parent, I think about Indian boarding schools. So when they were established in the US, they were established with the sole purpose of, it's multi-pronged. So like this idea of taking children out of the home to civilize them in schools where English is the only language taught, and children are basically, we're supposed to be taught like things in school, like to learn to read, to write, math, things like that. But they weren't actually doing that in these schools. A majority of these schools were actually forcing them to learn how to do domestic work. So the idea was that they would eventually serve in these roles once they leave the school. And that was basically going to be their jobs in real life, is to just, do the laundry, cook the food, clean the building, just keep maintenance, things like that. And so when I think about boarding schools, it's obviously something that I think is coming to the forefront with the discovery of these graveyards in these schools. But all of our families, most Native families, we all knew those graveyards have existed since like 1860. Like we've known they have existed. Wow. And even in Canada, like these are things that have happened, and we all knew that there were graveyards there. Some of them marked and some unmarked. And in the US alone, there are 367 schools that existed, and they crossed like 29 states, and they were managed by 14 different denominations, but a majority of them, like 80 of them, were Catholic. and the second one being Presbyterian, which was like 21. So like this was a significant project that was established in the US with the sole purpose of civilizing Native children, separating them from their families as a form of punishment to parents and their communities, for basically not following any of like the federal guidelines that were being put in place to just basically control us and to assimilate us to American culture. There's a lot of traumatic stories behind this. There's tons of Native women who are researchers and advocates who have done the work of documenting this and really doing all the work to demonstrate like the long-term effects of this. It's just all out there and just people don't know. And so like, it's almost a little bit like gaslighting when people are like, oh my God, I didn't know this. And it's like, don't say that. Like there's literally mountains of material. And like, there's even a website called the Indian Boarding School Healing Project where they have tons of like information there for you just to learn from. So it's really hard when I think in this space, it's nice because I get to talk to you about it, but like everyday life, people asking me about it is like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't want to tell you about this in like during my lunch break or something, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to have that process. So yeah. But then there's also like, I mean, I can just keep going if you want me to.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about the recent discoveries of these graveyards that people clearly knew existed. What prompted the acknowledgement of their existence?
You know what? I don't even know because honestly, I think it started with what was happening in Canada, and there were these mass graves with like hundreds, sometimes thousands of children. And I think that was where it started. In the US, I think it's always like, I don't know why there's this like amnesia around it, like this willful amnesia of like, oh, wasn't really that bad here. But then finding out that that was something that people were doing. And then Deb Holland, she's actually doing an entire initiative where she's going around the country trying to do some form of healing and discussing the boarding schools. So like, I would say she's a big part of that in the US. She's really pushed for that, like really thinking about what does it mean to address this issue on a national level. And I mean, there's families I know who've been fighting to get the remains back of their children and their ancestors, their ancestors who were children at the time, back from these schools for generations. And so like, I don't really know, like, I haven't studied that well enough. And it's probably because I'm too close to it that I'm like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like Native people have been demanding this for a really long time and people are just now listening. And I do think it has to do with what happened in Canada first.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Now we're going to move on, because that is very heavy, to another topic that can also be very heavy. But I recently learned more about forced sterilization because it was something that I think I had heard of, but then I learned about the topic of Mississippi appendectomies and how it was common to sterilize people that were considered undesirable. So in the South, especially, because it said Mississippi, but it was all over. And so Black women, Indigenous women, women that were, I guess, considered to be mentally ill or unfit in some way. And I know this is part of your work as well. What should we know about forced sterilization within Indigenous communities in particular? And what can we learn from them?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting topic that I always want to like do too much when I teach this because there's just like so many levels to it. But I laugh because I'm uncomfortable about the idea of just like not being able to cover everything. But like you said, this was something that was definitely happening with Black women, and it was very much connected to the same experience in regards to like why these things were happening. So like Puerto Rican women, Mexican women, and Indigenous women were like experiencing this at the same time as Black women. For Indigenous women, this was really specific. So in Native communities, we have the Indian Health Service, which is a federally underfunded program. So the federal government actually pays for this healthcare through these clinics, hospitals throughout the country. And there's not enough of them. That's one thing that's an issue, like physical space of like hospitals, clinics. There's just not enough of them and they're underfunded. I think they function at like 60%, I want to say. I think I might even be giving them too much too much props there. That might be a high estimate. So like there's this concept of like running out of money during the year. So the point is like Native women cannot get abortions at Indian Health Service. And this is two-pronged. So the first one is because of the Hyde Amendment. So back when Roe v. Wade was actually decided and passed, the federal government then came up with this idea of like federal funds cannot cover abortions unless the case of like sexual assault or including those by a parent, and then to protect the life of a mother. So this includes people who get Medicare, who go to IHS, and other forms of federal funded programs. So this is not a permanent law, but it's something that's actually attached to the congressional appropriations bill for the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's renewed every single year by Congress. So basically, this is just kind of a stipulation of the funding that goes that comes from the federal government, that they will not fund abortion except in those specific cases. And so Native women cannot get an abortion at IHS unless they fall under one of those three categories. So what they have to do is go to another clinic, kind of this idea of having to go somewhere else to get their care. So that was the first part. I think I'm going off tangent. Sorry. But thinking about sterilization, so this idea of getting care was a really important aspect of Native women's access to care. So IHS, sorry, that's where I went totally rogue. Sorry.
No, go rogue.
I was like, wait, I forgot what I was talking about. So IHS was the main provider for women's health care for Native women. And so between 1960s and 1976, between 3,400 and 70,000 Native women who are of childbearing age were actually sterilized. And this happened in a number of different ways. There's an excellent study. I really tried to find it today, but I could not. If I find the name, I'll definitely share it with you. But this amazing Native woman actually did a study, and she found that a lot of these doctors, their decision to actually sterilize women through tubal ligation or just an entire removal of like reproductive organs was based on the assumption that they didn't want to pay for the taxes that are required to care for these families. So they felt like Native women were a drain on society, essentially. And so they wanted to reduce that. So these doctors tend to be wealthy people or people who have higher status in our society and tend to they feel like they carry most of the load of like public, welfare. And so they felt like they had to do something about it. And so they took that opportunity to do that. So they also did things where they had women sign papers while they were under different drugs, while they were trying to have their children and they were in labor, after they gave birth, and then did the procedure of the tubal ligation, then they would have the woman sign the paper and backdate it sometimes. So there was like different forms of this. And then a lot of the times, women just really weren't sure what this procedure was. And some doctors, I believe there was one doctor specifically who told a woman that it was reversible, and she didn't learn till later that it wasn't when she was trying to have a baby. So like these are kind of examples of how these kind of structural systems function under individual behaviors, but also more structurally thinking about like, why would someone want to do this? And it's because of the capitalistic perspective. Like, these people are a drain on society, so I need to do something about it. And I have the power to do it. And I can coerce them into signing these papers. So like not having free and informed consent when you are being sterilized.
Yeah. It makes you think of in medicine and medical school when they're like, we need, diversity training and equity training, and people roll their eyes. And I'm like, well, you don't understand. how many doctors go into
Mm-hmm.
medicine and they were wealthy before they went to medical
Mm-hmm.
school. And so they have a very capitalistic perspective going
Right.
in. And I think there's a duty that if we're educating them, to educate them about the
Mm-hmm.
harm that medicine has
Right.
done,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, even if we're just focusing on the United States, the harm that medical doctors have
Mm-hmm.
done and how they have created this relationship that is
Mm-hmm.
rooted in fear and mistrust.
Right.
And
Right.
it's up to them to do the
Yeah.
work of acknowledging
Right.
wrongdoing
Right.
and then saying, what are you going to do to make sure that you don't do
Right.
that again?
Absolutely. And I also think about, so whenever I teach this topic, these topics are very heavy, and I try to do it in one lecture. I know I feel so bad for my students, but I try to like match that kind of like critique, that heavy, justified, like valid critique, with the concept of Indigenous women have always been like fighting against this. So the one woman that I think of around sterilization specifically was Marie Sanchez. So she was the Northern Cheyenne chief tribal judge. And so at the time, she was one of the founding members of WARN, which was the Women of All Red Nations. So people tend to know what AIM is. It's the American Indian Movement, which at the time was significant to our well-being, and like all of these things came from that. But WARN was like another arm of that. So it was all the women coming together and demanding things that were specific to their life that maybe weren't at the center of the movement that was often focused on men. So a lot of that movement was really focused on men. Some of the most, notable men come from AIM. So thinking of Russell Means, that's like one of the most notable people from that. But I think about WARN a lot. So these women working together and trying to form networks, not just within Native communities, but with organizations like Sister Song. So the organization that Loretta Ross was part of, like really recognizing the links between those. And she actually, Marie Sanchez, went to the UN in 1977, around the ending of like the sterilization that was documented at least. And she demanded more than just recognizing how the sterilization of Native women was a problem, the forced sterilization, but thinking about that within the context of how we treat the earth. And she really was like demanding that the UN recognize that extractive industries are like a form of that like not having free and informed consent for Native nations. And she was really pushing for them to have that conversation. So Native women have always, and much like Black women, we've always been at the forefront of our own struggle. It's just people just not refusing to recognize that in history or even talking about it. I had to dig really, really deep to find this information. So much so that I was like, is this real? And that's like messed up. I'm like, of course it's real because it's hidden. But like that's the thing. I don't want to like start a conspiracy theory. So I was like, I really got to be careful and like make sure I know who this is. And so I had to like find video just to like make sure I knew what I was talking about. And that's like the really awful part, is like this history exists, but you have to like dig for it, like really take the time. And not everybody has that time.
I mean, there are so many institutions invested in gaslighting us.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
They spent money. They spent money. Okay. So I know me and you have talked about this privately, about a certain TV show. That I like watching it, but it makes me so angry, and not for the reasons that people think of, or at least that I think like the white women that watch it think of. It's because of it doesn't acknowledge the role of race in reproductive justice. And that TV show is The Handmaid's Tale, which is an important show, but it angers me because there would be no Black handmaids. I'm sorry. There wouldn't be. There would
There would definitely be some Indigenous handmaids, because that's like the whole like goal, I would think.
Explain that. Explain.
So the whole like concept of settler colonialism is to erase the indigenous people, to ensure that there's no federal responsibility and settlers don't have a responsibility to us. So that then means this becomes theirs in a sense. So having children with indigenous women, I hate that I'm even saying this, but like in my mind, that's how it like horribly would have probably functioned, to like in a different kind of way. So I think about this when I think about, and this is for me triggering too, like when I hear people say my great grandmother was Cherokee, or like a different nation that is like maybe a little more distant from Navajo, and I just think about that, I'm like, you don't really understand how harmful that is, if especially if you don't really know, because it's a form of erasure to be like, well, nobody really knows who's Native, so I can just say this.
Yeah.
And not having Native people means there's no federal responsibility to us, and everything that they have, they can claim as their own, and there's no responsibility, there's no guilt there. So yeah, I think it would function different.
Yeah.
And that's what I always tell my students, like, you know, the erasure of Native people and the treatment of Black people, they go hand in hand. They're not like opposing each other. That's not how that works. They like function together to sustain settler colonialism.
Okay. So you have erasure of Native people, and then would that be paired with enslavement of Black people, or how do you envision that?
So I think about like the erasure of Native people is to ensure that we just don't exist, that our culture doesn't exist, so we're not real. We're just, you know, people who didn't become Americans very well. Whereas I think Black folks, there's a hypervisibility that I feel like I noticed, and I will be really careful because I'm not in Black studies, so I'm really careful with that. But I think about the hypervisibility of Blackness and how it functions within capitalism for the purpose of like extracting from Black people as much as you can, whatever that looks like, all the time. And those two things like function together for the purpose of white supremacy to thrive, like both those things.
Yeah. So like cultural appropriation is what
or even like having Black folks do the labor of whatever it is. It's teaching you about white supremacy. Like that's a form of labor when Black people could just be doing something else to like enrich their lives, but they have to tell you about all this shit and like process that with other people. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like when people expect you to educate them.
Yes.
I mean, I had a coworker who basically used a racial slur against me and had been harassing me. And when she literally tried to attack me at a work party. Wow. She was the privilege. The privilege kept her job too. And when I told her, I was like, "Girl, you've harassed me for months," and I named everything she did. She started crying. And then she said, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you educate me?"
No. You're like, I am though right now. Like, this is it.
Like, this is the education. She's like, "Just tell me whenever I do anything." I was like, "I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that. I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to talk to you. And you're going to cry again."
Yes. Yeah, no, for sure. I think about that a lot. Like, and I've read so many like brilliant Black feminist writers and womanist writers that have like taught me that, because I didn't recognize that. I was like, holy shit, like I actually engage in some of this when it's not about intention. It's just the fact that I've learned this from like my surroundings and living in a white supremacist society. Like even as an Indigenous woman, I have to be really careful because that jumps out. Like it's very easy and people don't realize how often that happens in daily life. Like it's really hard. I think about when I teach too, my students are always like, we need more people of color in these positions making decisions. I'm like, you're gonna make people of color fix all of this? We just want like food and housing and like space to just be. I don't want to, I don't know, like that sounds lazy too. So that's the hard part, because I'm like, I'm not trying to like say I'm not responsible for any of this, but like for you to say that puts all the work on the people most impacted.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part about it.
Yeah.
It's like, on one hand, we should be dictating how funds are used in our communities to improve them or whatever. At the same time, that's a lot of work. You want me to go to commission meetings? You want me to be on an advisory board?
Oh, God.
You want me... Wait a minute. Are these paid positions? Right. Are you even going to pay me?
Do I have to do my other job on top of this job? Because that's 2 jobs. Even if I get paid for both, that's still 2 jobs.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And then,
is this why you're only paying us 54 and 64 cents on the dollar? We gotta like put in the extra work to get the full dollar. You gotta sit on the commission, and that's what that's for. I see. I
do think about that. Truly, like, because I mean, I teach CBPR, so we talk about how to center the voice of the community. I'm like, the community.
What is CBPR?
So community-based participatory research is basically centering the decision-making and all of the focus on what the community wants with regards to research. So giving them basically significant amount of power. And this is really hard for academics and researchers to do, is to kind of give up that power and accept what the community feels is more important and how they want to do it and what they want to do with that information. It's most of the time not publish a paper. so how do you do that as a process when your grant says you have to publish a paper, or your tenure file says you have to publish a paper to get, tenure? So yeah, I think about that a lot, like asking a community that's trying to survive, like, let's talk about research, and they're like, get out of here, like, we don't want to do that. Can you just give us the money? Like, I really wish we could just say that more often as communities. Just be like, just give us the money. We don't want to do research. We just need more money. Yeah,
exactly.
And
I think we've talked about that before. It's like, how do you fix poverty? Money. I need money. Give me money.
Yeah, lots of it.
I will use it to pay my rent, buy a house, live a nice life, feed my dogs, and I don't want kids, but if I did, feed my kids.
Yeah.
No,
that's...
And live a nice life.
That would be hard.
Sleep sometimes.
It's a funder. Like, a funder would be like, what is that? I'm just trying to get on your level. Like, I don't understand why this is so hard to comprehend.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've covered a lot of bases. Is there anything that you would want listeners or viewers to walk away with when it comes to opening up their concept of reproductive justice, reproductive health?
There's one thing I want to say that I feel like it didn't really answer for you, and you brought it up early on. So I don't even know if I'm answering your current question, but I just realized I didn't answer the question you asked me. It was about social workers. So thinking about that, and I hope it's okay if I redirect a little bit.
Of course. Of course.
So when I was thinking about social workers, there's the Indian adoption program project that was run in the United States from like 58 to 67. So like right on the heels of like Indian boarding school. So this was a concerted effort by the Child Welfare League, a number of churches in the U.S., and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Children's Bureau. So what they did was they adopted out Native kids from their families to white families in order to assimilate them and basically have them like in a different form of like an Indian boarding school, but to families, obviously. So about 390 kids were adopted out of 16 different Western nations. And they were placed with white families, specifically in the East and the Midwest. So the purpose was to move them from their families and their community so they could sever ties and just grow up in a white community with a white family. So there were a number of other federal funded adoption programs that existed at the same time. And what ended up happening was like 1 in 4 Native kids was removed from their family, to 85% of them being in non-Native homes. So what came out of this in 78, so like a year after this project was kind of like ceased, was this idea of thinking about how do we reform the system so that it ensures the rights of the family, like the child, the family, and the nation are respected. So the idea came from Evelyn Lance Blanchard. She was a PhD. She was Laguna and Yaqui, and she worked with the Association of American Indian Affairs. And they basically stipulated this entire law. They pushed for it, and her role specifically was to work with Native nations to ensure that they understood their rights and that the families did, so that they would be able to be part of the process. So, so trying to make sure that the family maintained their bond with the child, ensure that Native families were the first in line to decide to be, eligible to adopt this child, and then also notifying the tribe and the parents of any proceedings that were happening when this kid was being adopted away, or decisions were made around this. And then just to ensure that the tribe and the parents were involved at all stages of the proceedings, because in the past, none of that was happening. So Evelyn Lance Blanchard, she really wanted to ensure that the parents and the family were involved in all of the custody hearings and every step of the process, which was not happening before. So she really pushed for this, and it was just amazing to see that. Like, this again was something in the history that I didn't know, and I had to dig deep for, and it was really frustrating to know that I didn't know this. But thinking about that made me think of our conversation about social work and how what is considered neglect in a family. So thinking about poverty being seen solely as neglect instead of a structural problem. So what are you supposed to do when a child does not have enough food to eat, doesn't have a home, things like that? So the decision is usually to take the child out at that time. So what does that then mean for like families that fall into poverty or have had generational poverty? So thinking about that and other forms of like learning how to parent and experiences of structural harm against parents in their childhood, thinking about the boarding schools. So parents may not know how to raise their children according to these standards that social workers have. So how do you ensure that you're not re-harming these families that have already been harmed structurally with the same structures, saying that they're not good enough to be parents to these kids that, are then being put in other families that don't identify as Native or even part of their nation.
Yeah, I thought a lot about that when it comes to poverty, and why is it that we don't just give those families the money? Why do we like, if that's the issue or the central issue, you're going to give money to a stranger that child does not know, which I imagine as a child, I know I would be terrified.
Yeah.
If my parent is not abusing me,
right?
They're just poor.
Yeah. No, that's so true.
It's crazy to me that is and still is like, that's the solution.
Yeah. No, and I think about parents who don't want to get into systems of like any kind of system in fear of like being seen as like neglectful. Like, how do they navigate that? So they ask for help, but just enough to where they don't look like they're incompetent to like the state. And then that creates a whole system in place for them to be, to have their children taken away.
Yeah. So Beatrice, we've talked about so much. And of course we can't talk about everything. For those that want to learn more about reproductive rights in Indigenous communities, reproductive justice, do you have any books you would recommend or podcasts you would recommend so they can continue with their education?
Yeah, no, there's like a ton of stuff, but I think kind of thinking of the more like academic perspective and the legal perspective is Sarah Deer, who's a citizen of Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She wrote a just stellar book about the beginning and end of rape. I know that sounded weird, those two statements together, but like she really did an excellent job of just weaving together a really full story. It's a very difficult book to get through, so I definitely want to recommend people be careful about approaching that book and just be thoughtful about your own, space and where you're at. But I think another book is more, I think, a manageable read in a less academic way, I think. So The Round House by Louise Erdrich. She's a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. She's one of the most well-known Native writers, and she has her own bookstore in Minneapolis, which I love. It's called the Birch Bark Bookstore. It's just cute. It's amazing. I love it. And then a film would be Young Lakota. It's a really hard film to come by, but it's just amazing, and it talks about abortion and one tribal president, a woman trying to get an abortion clinic on her reservation, and just all the ins and outs of what she faces from people in South Dakota and then the people on her reservation. And then the last one I would recommend is This Land by Rebecca Nagel, and she's a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And that specific podcast talks about ICWA, so the Indian Child Welfare Act. So thinking about the Adopting Out Project and how Native people have tried to push back against that with ICWA. I think it's the most timely one because that is one of the issues in the Supreme Court right now. How to ensure that ICWA stays in place so Native children are not further adopted out of our communities at higher rates.
Great. Wonderful. Beatriz, I want to thank you for taking time to sit here, speak with me, speak with the audience. I had an amazing time.
Yes.
I think it was fun. Even though it was a heavy topic, I really learned a lot, and I want to thank you for the recommendations. And we're going to close out the episode.
Okay.
Thanks for listening in. Please write in about any questions, comments, or concerns. And if you think you really get it, send in some answers. Be sure to follow She Really Gets It on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever else podcasts are found.